Welcome to Season 1, Episode 3 of A Story Club Global Politics. This is a unique venture streaming simultaneously from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, Dehra Dun in India, and San Francisco in the United States. We speak with people around the world to get a deep understanding of politics and political events at both a global and a local level. We go beyond the sound bites and the spin to get insider perspectives and understandings that you won't get anywhere else. Today, my guest is Helga Zepp-LaRouche, founder and president of the International Schiller Institute in Germany. Welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Very good, very good. Our topic today is rebuilding economies in a post-lockdown world. And I'll just set it up with a little introduction and we'll get right into it with our guest. But the global economy is sick right now. The unprecedented lockdowns occurring simultaneously across the world has thrown many people out of work, stopped international travel, hindered trade, closed entire industries, and increased money printing, debt, and government cash disbursements around the world. Where is this all leading to? And what is the new normal that the world is being asked to accept? Is the old normal something we want to return to, or is there a better alternative? Well, today we have the founder and president of the International Schiller Institute in Germany, as I mentioned, to discuss these issues. She and her organization has been involved in these issues very intimately at the highest levels for many decades, and they continue to be active with very important projects. Welcome, Helga, again. Can you tell our audience who might not know about the Schiller Institute or your work, a bit more of your background, the work of your institute, and particularly as it relates to the issues of reconstructing the global economy?
Well, to be very brief, I was a journalist after my high school. Then I started to study in Berlin. And, then I had the opportunity to become a journalist and, have a trip to China in the middle of the Cultural Revolution with a cargo ship. Now, this is important because when you travel with a cargo ship, you get to see the world from a perspective which is not like a cruise ship or like a luxury, but I got to see Africa and parts of some countries in Africa and some countries in Asia, including China, from the standpoint of the working people, the misery people live through. And, this is why when I came back from this journey, which was more than almost 3/4 of a year, I found that the only person at that time, in 1971, who was speaking about the need to industrialize the developing countries was LaRouche, who naturally was not yet my husband at the time, but I found him through lectures in Berlin. And, he had actually the vision to overcome the poverty, the underdevelopment of the developing countries of all continents. So I thought that that is exactly what I had come to the conclusion which had to be done. So I joined his organization and we started to develop development programs very concretely for the industrialization of Africa, which we published in 76. In 75, he already proposed the replacement for the IMF, which was called the International Development Bank, which was the idea to provide long-term, low-interest credit for, well-defined projects which would have overcome, the poverty and the underdevelopment. And this is what we have been doing, continuously. We worked on an OASIS plan for Southwest Asia, on a development plan for Latin America, for the 40-year development of India, 50-year development of the Pacific Basin. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, in 91, we already had a plan to connect the industrial and population centers of Europe with those of Asia, which we called the Eurasian Land Bridge. And that proposal I could present at a big conference in China in 96. And at that time, China already was committed to make such a Eurasian land bridge development the long-term strategic perspective of China until 2010. But then came the Asia crisis in 97, and all these plans got halted. So, but the Schiller Institute, oh, I forgot, in the meantime, in the beginning of the 80s, I founded the Schiller Institute, which was devoted to the idea of implementing a new world economic order in combination with the renaissance of classical cultures. And the reason why I choose the name of Friedrich Schiller, who is a very famous German poet, is because he has the most beautiful image of man, namely that every man can become a beautiful soul, a genius, through the aesthetical education. So this is what the Schiller Institute set out to do. And we kept making these development plans. We had literally, I mean, if you look at our websites, you will find that we had thousands of events, seminars, conferences in 5 continents. So when Xi Jinping, the president of China, in 2013 announced the new Silk Road, we were extremely happy because here you had now a very important country basically proposing and doing the same kind of economic development plans which we had campaigned for all these decades. So now, in a certain sense, there is a coincidence between the idea of a new Silk Road and what we as an organization have been fighting for more than 40 years.
Right. Yeah. I mean, now, I just want to delve into a few aspects of the history a little more, and we'll take it up to today. But it's because it's important. I mean, I studied development studies at the University of Toronto in the 1980s. That was my first degree. Then I did development studies in Jamaica after, and I've always been in the field of development economics and development studies, etc. And the new international economic order at the time was something that we were very much aware of, and it was because the debt crisis in the 1980s, Mexico, Argentina, and the defaults and all these development problems and failure of the development paradigm, and Fred Wills of Guyana, neighboring Guyana, tabled the proposals for a new international economic order at the UN. So we were aware of these things, but we were not aware of the LaRouche movement at all and your role in this. When I discovered it, just a few years ago, well after my university learning, I was amazed that you all started this thing, and it was after the Bretton Woods collapse in 71, 72, when you realized that what was going to happen was a whole new type of economic exploitation and banking financial capitalism, essentially, that was not going to be good for global development, and you started to work on this, but that's been sort of blotted out of the official development history that that's taught at universities. And I used to teach development studies at the University of the West Indies, and again, I never taught anything about what you did because I didn't know about it. Could you please talk about why that is that your central role in this whole process may have been obscured throughout history in your very important struggles?
Well, I mean, first of all, it may be interesting for your audience to know that Fred Wills, the foreign minister of Guyana, was actually a member of the Schiller Institute.
Right.
He was on the board, and we had a very great collaboration. The reason why the oligarchy absolutely wanted to keep us out of the picture is because they were completely afraid of the ideas, especially of my husband, who passed away last year. But I think, I am absolutely willing to defend the thesis that he was the greatest living genius of his time. And if people don't believe that, you are welcome to look at his writings and judge your judgment yourself. But he made proposals repeatedly, which were picked up by presidents. You mentioned our collaboration with Ronald Reagan, with Indira Gandhi, with Lopez Portillo, and many others, by the way, President Banisa and others. And I think they were worried that governments, powerful governments, would pick up his ideas. I give you one example. Lopez Portillo, who knew about.
And that's of Mexico for those people who may not know. Yes, President Lopez Portillo of Mexico, right? So the work you did with him.
I mean, he knew about us because we had members in Mexico, and he was wondering, what are these people doing? What makes them tick? So he started a dialogue with them and got totally impressed. So when the Mexican peso was under attack in 1982, he invited my husband to come to Mexico to write him a program of defense, to defend the capital flight against the capital flight. And my husband not only wrote a program for Mexico, but for all of Latin America, which was called Operation Juarez. And Lopez Portillo implemented that on the 1st September 1982. And at that time, Wall Street and the city of London were completely freaked out that this would be the debt bomb, that the indebted countries, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, who had together a debt of $200 billion, which is nothing compared to the money now, but it was a lot then, that they would form a debtors cartel and that would be the end of Wall Street. This was not the proposal of my husband. As a matter of fact, my husband proposed the kind of reorganization of the international financial system, which actually would have saved them. It would have saved also the developing countries, but it was not an effort to destroy. It was an effort to create a credit mechanism for real development. And then naturally, when President Reagan picked up on the proposal of my husband of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the entire transatlantic financial establishment went completely berserk. And so there were many points where when we started to get resonance with actual governments implementing these ideas, they decided that they will not give us any kind of stage. They will only slander us in the media and suppress these ideas. And that pretty much has been going on until the present day, which is why I'm fighting very hard also for the rehabilitation of my husband, who is the most beautiful soul, but he's one of the most controversial people, not because of him, but because of what the oligarchy threw against him.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and just to sort of try to summarize it for the listeners to you, and you can tell me if you think my summary is accurate, but it basically, the LaRouche movement has been about for the industrial development of Africa, Asia, Latin America, so the poorer countries of the world, of getting advanced infrastructure, of bringing the economies up to the level through massive investments in infrastructure and the real economy, in production and whatnot. Whereas what happened in 1972, for people who understand the history of the global economy, when the dollar was delinked from gold in the United States and the Bretton Woods system collapsed and the fixed exchange rates were abandoned, you had all sorts of financial speculation. And that's when the debt crisis came out of control. And instead of real development, you had all sorts of paper development, financial and inequalities and the debt crises. So you basically found yourself in a battle with the sort of big financial interests of Wall Street, of the Washington institutions, I suppose, like the IDB, IMF, World Bank, and the City of London. for real development as opposed to financial service development, the imaginary economy. Is that a good summary of your position, would you say?
Yes, yes. As a matter of fact, I think one of the most marked interventions of my husband, which will be noted by historians if there is a word to discuss it, was that when Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold standard and eliminated the fixed exchange rate system to replace it with floating exchange rates, my husband made an absolutely prophetic analysis. He said, if the world financial system continues on that road, that is monetarism, neoliberal policy, austerity, that it would necessarily lead to a new fascism and a new depression and the danger of war, or completely alternative, there would be a new global economic system. So if you look at that prognosis in 71, everything what we see right now, a bankrupt financial system, a pandemic. My husband in 1973 formed something which we called the Biological Task Force, which studied the impact of the austerity policy of the IMF and the World Bank on the developing countries. And my husband wrote at that time that if you lower the living standard of entire continents over decades, you are inviting pandemics and the emergence of old and new diseases. And then he also prescribed what should be done against it, namely to develop the countries to really increase the living standard, to have basically the kind of industrial development based on high development of science and technology, which would have brought up the developing countries to the level of the United States, Europe, and Japan, and so forth. So that was, what he prognosed, and we published about the danger of pandemics, probably 6 major studies, which if you read them today, it was so visionary of what would happen, what we see now with the coronavirus pandemic. So if you ask yourself, why do we have this pandemic, which is causing all this havoc in the global economy? It is not because of the virus. This pandemic is the result of the policies of the IMF and the World Bank by preventing development of the developing countries. The proof of that is very clear, because if you look at China, they were hit with the coronavirus sometimes end of December, beginning of January. They went into a complete lockdown of 20 million people or more. They applied very rigorous means, tracing, isolating, masks, social distancing, even quarantine for 2 months, very rigorous. The whole country came to the support of that region of Hubei province, and they could contain it. Now, just imagine if every country on the planet would have an equally well-organized health system, which would have responded with the same absolute resolution to contain it, we would not have a pandemic. That's the whole point. You can fight the emergence of pandemics with a good health system. This is why I was calling immediately when it was clear that it was a pandemic. I said, now the absolute immediate response has to be every single country on this earth must have a modern health system on the level of, what used to be the Hilbert standard in the United States, or the German system as it was before the privatization of the health sector occurred, or the Chinese now having demonstrated in Wuhan. If you would have such a health system in every single country, you could contain not only the coronavirus pandemic, but you can prevent future pandemics which are looming and threatening. You could prevent them from ever taking such a terrible toll again. That's what we have to fight for right now.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's the linking of pandemics to underdevelopment is important. I mean, I remember when, like, you know, the Ebola crisis virus first came out too. I mean, when I was looking at the epidemiological data and looking at the spread, I mean, I realized that, okay, this is occurring in poor countries with poor health systems, and that when it, you know, if it were to spread out of those systems, it wouldn't spread very far, but it is the result of it is an effect of underdevelopment. And I mean, and just to give the listeners a sense of the type of development that's on a totally different scale than what is normally talked about. I mean, the type of development you're talking about is technology led, like nuclear power and going for fusion power. I remember interviewed one of your associates in the Schiller Institute, Hussein Askari, talking about development in the Middle East and how that would, you know, development would bring about peace, and that how you could turn a $50 barrel of oil into a $500 barrel, not by exporting raw oil as raw material, as fuel to burn, but using it as an industrial feedstock to make plastics and all sorts of usable products, which is what the other countries do with it. So what you're speaking about is a whole different level of development, which these organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, and the major financial institutions that lend for development prevent from happening. Can you elaborate on that a little more for me, please?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, if you should have an image, let's say, of the German infrastructure. I don't know if you have a sense when you sit on the Rhine, for example. This is a major river in Germany. You see one cargo ship after the other. It's like a perfect example of what infrastructure should do. Then these ships go to inland ports and ports on the coast, and they are connected to the train system, highway system, and it's all very dense. Now, the density of the infrastructure is sort of the precondition for agriculture, for industry, because without infrastructure, you know, take Sudan, for example. Sudan has the most fertile soil in the world. It's so fertile that you don't need fertilizer. If you had irrigation, you could have 3-4 harvests without any problem. Now, obviously, you couldn't even transport the food, the produce, because you don't have infrastructure. So even to have developed agriculture, you need a functioning system of ports, of trains, of, you know, highways. And so in a certain sense, the development of the infrastructure is how the industrialization of every industrialized country has started. You know, in the United States, in Russia, in Germany, in Japan. So what we have always said is you have to start with basic infrastructure, and then you naturally have to have energy production and distribution. And that energy must have a high energy flux density, which is why we are opposing solar and wind. I mean, they may have niches where they are useful at certain points, but not as a major energy source, because one of the major contributions of my husband was that he discovered the correlation of the energy flux density in the production process and the appropriate or corresponding population density, which can be maintained. So, with other words, since we have now a population which is above 7 billion people, you need fossil fuels, which has a higher energy flux density than solar and wind. You need nuclear energy fission, because that gives you a much higher energy flux density and much higher productivity in the production process. And that is why we are pushing so hard to get the crash program for thermonuclear fusion power, because once you have thermonuclear fusion power, this will be a complete break in the history of mankind, because it will give you for the first time energy security for tens of thousands of years, because you will use deuterium and tritium, which is plenty in the ocean waters, as a fuel. And the Chinese are already engaged in preparing to have mining of helium-3 from the backside of the moon, which will allow even more efficient production of energy than deuterium and tritium. So if we reach that, we will be able to concern ourselves with completely different issues, like the real issue is, what is mankind all about? Why are we here? Why is man existing in the universe? What is the specific character of the human species? How can we study life sciences? How can we defeat all kinds of diseases which we don't know yet how to solve? How can we colonize nearby space? And all of these wonderful things. So I think we are at a very important point, where we have to realize the real potential of the human species. And that must be something for the entire human species, not just for some countries, which is why we want the developing countries to leapfrog, to not repeat all the technological developments of the so-called advanced countries, but they should participate immediately through education of their youth, through training programs in the most advanced programs, so that they can share the benefits of the most advanced sciences. And that is basically, on the verge of either happening or being lost forever.
Right, right. Now, well, this is important because we get to the politics of it. Because so you have this vision of advanced industrial development that requires a lot of financing, and then you have the financial institutions that don't want to finance that type of development for whatever reasons or ideologies that they hold. Sometimes it might be green ideology, sometimes it might be this idea of appropriate development or whatever it might be. So I we do have an audience from India. They might be interested in the story. Let's take a look at the story of one of your interventions, because as I said, you went pretty far in America with Ronald Reagan. A lot of people don't know about really what was the story behind the Star Wars program, for example, or Lopez Portillo, for example, and the currency manipulation, which you talked about. But let's say Indira Gandhi, who I know you all were close to, and I know that you had a plan for the industrialization of India at a time in the 70s when India, was experiencing great poverty, and not like what was happening today. So could you sort of maybe tell us the story of how far you got, and then how it those plans maybe fell by the wayside?
Yeah, we had also at that time, in the end of the 70s, some Indian members, people who liked the ideas of LaRouche. So we got an invitation to visit with Mrs. Gandhi several times. And my husband worked on a program for the 40-year development of India. Now, that was, at that time, this was in the beginning of the 80s, but in 79, India had an urban population of 50 million people, and I think a total population of 750 million people. So that, was not
Very small.
Not many, not a high percentage, but 50 million people on an urban level comparable to Europe or the United States is not bad.
Yes.
So the idea was that you would make this development plan over 2 generations. In the first generation, you would develop basic infrastructure in the entire country, because at that time in particular, and still to the present day, there are areas of India, like in the northeast, they only have dirt roads. They don't have an integrated infrastructure program. So that was part of it. The second one was to have universal education for all the children, because we visited farms in the countryside, and because of the poverty, many of the farmers would not send their children to school, but they would have to help with the harvest. And naturally, this was a big problem because if you don't have a good education for the children and the youth, your next generation will not be as productive. So the first part of this program was this twofold approach, infrastructure and universal education. And then that would have been the basis to really industrialize all of India in the second generation. So Mrs. Gandhi liked that program a lot. And, she liked also Friedrich Schiller a lot, because when she was in France, she read much of Schiller in French. She liked Jeanne d'Arc, the Virgin of Orleans, and she actually said that this was her role model. And, it just happened to be that I was also extremely inspired as a young girl by Jeanne d'Arc. This is a very powerful image of a potent woman.
Yeah. Just for English speakers, we normally say Joan of Arc, but in French, where she's from, France, is Jeanne d'Arc. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful play by Schiller, which, our audience, if you want to take some time, it's worth reading it because it shows you, that's always the subject of Schiller's dramas, that man, in that moment, woman is greater than his or her destiny, and that you can overcome even the starkest obstacles if you have a plan and if you are courageous. So anyway, that was one thing which connected me to Indira Gandhi, which I'm very fond of, because when you share such ideals when you are young, it means something for you.
Right. And I mean, so what happened with with the program and your involvement? How did it unravel, if that's the correct way to put it?
Well, it was the same fight like in every country, because this proposal, which my husband made in 75 already, the IDB, the International Development Bank, we actually talked for 1 year to all the countries of the developing sector, the non-aligned movement. And when they had their summit in 76, they adopted practically this entire proposal as a wish for a new world economic order. Now, then the most incredible counter movement started. Mrs. Gandhi, this was before we visited her, but it was the same kind of a fight. She got destabilized. Mrs. Bandaranaike of Sri Lanka got destabilized. They killed Ali Bhutto. So you had a real effort to suppress the desire of the developing countries for this development. As you know, Mrs. Gandhi got assassinated. We kept working with Rajiv Gandhi. He got assassinated. And, now, we were in contact with practically all the cabinet members of the Indira Gandhi government, who became dear friends of us. The president of India, Mr. Narajran, I'm pronouncing it badly, he was the ambassador of India in Washington during the time of the Indira Gandhi government. And we visited him many times at his residence. And he received us beginning of the 2000. And he said in that meeting, he said to my husband, "You are the only American we can trust." And that was the few of many, because they have seen how many of the so-called developed countries would use the developing countries as geopolitical pawns, and they knew my husband would absolutely not do that. So, we still have fond memories of India, and we just hope we can revive these, younger generations today.
Yes, and so that's interesting there in terms of the past efforts. Now, just before I was going to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative and the coronavirus, but let's jump to the coronavirus issue. So now, how you've been picking up a lot of momentum, especially with the Belt and Road Initiative from China being so much in alignment with your world land bridge idea to connect the whole world with advanced infrastructure in every country, so that it raises the development of all. And it's a totally new paradigm that is still not properly understood. But then this pandemic came in. So I'd like you to tell me how you think that has changed or affected the planet, because it on a number of ways. Not only, it's direct effects in terms of, whatever communications have broken down, depression in the world economy, but also politically too, because now there's a very strong anti-China feeling in the world. There's, in Europe, in United States, in India, and other, they really believe that China is behind the whole pandemic itself, and that it's a plot to control the world. And so we have these things coming in. So can you just give us your understanding of the process, and where it is, how this thing may have undermined it, and what can we do to go forward?
Well, it's very dangerous, because to blame China for the spread of the virus, it's a lie. This came from Neil Ferguson, some British American historian, so-called, who just invented it. He said, that China closed down Wuhan, but allowed international flights, internet to go to many countries, and that way they consciously spread it. That's why the Henry Jackson Society then said they should pay 9 trillion compensation for all the damage this has created worldwide, which is an incredible lie. There was another American professor whose name I have now forgotten, who went to look at the flight schedule from Wuhan, and he could prove that all the flights which Neil Ferguson claimed have happened, they were all cancelled. So this was a lie put in the world by British intelligence, came from Sir Richard Dearlove, one of the former heads of MI6. And it came from, as I said, the Henry Jackson Society, which is a hardcore neocon outfit which works with the worst neocons in the United States. And they're just spreading that. And the reality is, it is not because China did anything. I think it is very clear, and I've talked to many medical professionals since, they all agree that China has set up a new standard in fighting the pandemic. What is really behind that is, when the Chinese president put the new Silk Road on the agenda and started to implement the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, for several years, the mainstream media in the West did not report it. And, since we had the same program, we are looking, why don't they report this? This is the biggest infrastructure program in history ever, and they're just blocking it out. And then I think it started about 2018. There was a sudden shift. All the think tanks in the United States and Europe came out almost simultaneously with the line, China is a dictatorship, it's an authoritarian system, they are suppressing human rights, they're causing the debt trap for the developing countries. And what was behind that was the clear recognition that China had developed an approach not only to overcome their own poverty, they lifted 850 people out of poverty, but they offered that to other countries who were happy, because it was the first time that after colonialism, anybody offered them infrastructure development and to actually replicate the kind of Chinese economic approach. China is not proselytizing. They don't want to force anybody to become a socialist country. They're not trying to export Confucianism. But at that time, what we call the British Empire, which is really the entire financial system of central banks, of big investment banks, of cartels, they derived their power on the present system of speculation. And they realized that if there is a different approach, which puts the common good of the people in the center of things, it's more attractive.
Yeah,
And naturally,
I just want to just for the audience, I know you use the term the British Empire a lot, and a lot of people might be confused by the term, but I think a way for most people to understand it is that I don't think people understand how central the city of London is to the entire world financial system from the 19th century and perhaps earlier up to the present day, and all the world's transactions, the major loan is goes through. That's why the LIBOR, the London Interbank overnight rate, is the central measure used, because that financial system in the city of London, which is actually governed separately from the rest of Britain, which people don't even understand, is is so central to this financial global capitalism, and this is what you're referring to, correct?
yes. And Wall Street is just a junior partner of that same banking system.
Right.
But
Wall Street is.
City of London is much more important than even Wall Street. And the hedge funds, the whole, if you look how many hedge funds have their headquarters in London, you would be surprised. And they're working with the central banks. They're behind the money pumping after 2008, which has gone mostly to the speculators, very little investment in the real economy. And, that is the system which has made the rich more rich and more rich and more rich, and destroyed the middle class in many countries. And they depend on a high rate of speculation. And they know that right now they're really bankrupt, which is why they are so absolutely adamant, determined to prevent the rise of China. So a lot of what you see, the so-called demonstrations in Hong Kong, the whole issue of Taiwan, all the lies about the Uyghur issue, that there's supposedly a concentration camp in Xinjiang. We had two members of the Schiller Institute traveling to Xinjiang, and they visited and they reported a completely different story, namely that the Chinese were trying to fight terrorism in the region by a huge economic development program, and giving the population, which would have been otherwise attracted to terrorism, that they had a perspective of developing jobs. So a lot of this stuff is really the total opposite of what is being said. So I think that that is really a big fight. But go to the Schiller side. We publish a lot of these things, and you find a different story.
Yeah. Now, currently, your institute engages in a lot of campaigns, which all fits into the bigger picture, but it's kind of like step by step and adjusting to the current climate, so that the larger vision can move ahead. And currently the phase of your campaign, let's say, as far as I understand it, is a campaign to create 1.5 billion new productive jobs around the world. And this is in response to, to what's happened with the coronavirus, the pandemic and lockdown. Could you explain, the thinking behind it, and the plan and program, and what you want to excite the rest of the world to be involved in?
But it is very clear that if we want to protect the human species against not only the coronavirus pandemic, but also the danger of new such diseases emerging, which every health expert tells you, now there's no guarantee that it will not happen tomorrow, or even worse than what we have experienced now. So the only protection against that is what I said earlier. You need a modern health system in every country. Now, we want to have training programs for young people. They should be taught how to be medical assistants. We want to have American youth working with African youth, with Latin American youth, and help them in a kind of training program, hook up hospitals between the United States and developing countries, Europe and developing countries, to help to overcome this present situation, which really needs to be done on an emergency basis, because every day this is not happening. Look how many people are living, working in the so-called informal economy. 60% of the world population. That means people in India, in Africa, in Latin American countries, they're working from the hand into the mouth. When you had the lockdowns, these people were suddenly confronted with starvation. The World Food Program has warned repeatedly that in addition and as a consequence of the pandemic, we are threatened with a worldwide famine, which could soon kill 300,000 people a day. Now, if you look at the poverty, the locust plague, which is now raving in Africa and many Asian countries, the problems are so enormous that the only way how you can solve that is you have to create new productive jobs. We want to have 50 million in the United States, 50 million in Europe, and the rest in the developing countries to really start to overcome the poverty in earnest. Not just talking about development aid, but have a real industrialization of the developing countries. Now, how can that be done? You have this anti-China campaign you mentioned. It's almost going to the danger of war. I'm very concerned that this can completely go out of control, because when you create an enemy image where you say China is responsible for this pandemic, they have to pay all the economic damage. This is an enemy image for the preparation of war, and I'm extremely concerned about that. So when the assassination of General Soleimani occurred on the 3rd of January, I called for a summit between the most important countries, the United States, Russia, and China, to overcome these kinds of geopolitical games and dangers. Because President Trump has said, and he campaigned for that in 2016, that he wants to improve the relationship with Russia. And he, in the beginning of his office, had a very good friendship with President Xi Jinping. So it's not Trump who is the problem, but it is the neocons around him. So in the meantime, President Putin has called for a summit of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. And Foreign Minister Lavrov just said they're working on aspects of it. The date is not yet fixed, but it will take place hopefully long before the US election. And we are campaigning of the Schiller Institute with conferences since April. We had one in April, in May, in June, and we will have another one, very importantly, beginning of September, where we basically say we want to discuss in these conferences what the agenda of the permanent 5 countries of the UN Security Council must be. And where should the solution come from, if not from the most powerful countries in a life-threatening crisis like the one we experience right now? So we want them to adopt a new credit system, a new Bretton Woods system, which would provide long-term, cheap credit for development purposes. Low credit, low interest rate, long-term, so that the debt trap would be not existing. Then, we have to have an increase in the productivity of the economy, which is why we want fusion power. We want an orientation on international space cooperation, because that defines the future, how the different nations can work together for the common aims of mankind. Then naturally, there must be a new security architecture based on that common economic interest. I mean, I know that Putin is very concerned about that, the Russians in general, Chinese as well. And yesterday, President Trump tweeted that he's working with Russia on the nuclear disarmament pact. And he said this is the most important question of our time. And I was very positively surprised to hear that from Trump, because I think this is extremely important as a war avoidance question. So if these 5 governments would adopt such a comprehensive plan to get the world out of this crisis, we could really enter a new era. And I really want to ask your audience that all of you can help to do to further that, because what we need is an international chorus of voices. Presidents of developing countries, institutions, individuals who care about the world, they should all join that chorus, demanding that the P5 summit must adopt a new world economic order, an international platform to overcome the poverty in the world, and really, defeat this pandemic by international cooperation. Russia has just made a breakthrough in developing a new vaccine. In the United States, the pandemic is raving. I think if President Trump, President Putin, if they would agree together with China to work on not only the development of vaccines, the distribution and application of the medical program for the whole world, it would change the world. That is how Trump could win the election, for sure. Because, the world needs an answer from the most powerful countries that they care. I mean, you see a lot of desperation right now in many parts of the world where people have lost the trust in the institutions. You have all these conspiracy people who seek that all the plot, that the coronavirus does not exist. But unfortunately, it does exist, and unfortunately, it's causing a lot of people's life right now. So we are in an existential crisis, but there is the solution, and the solution would be that we develop this chorus of institutions, of countries, of concerned people to all demand that now is the time to go into a new era, to go into a new paradigm of international relations. And I'm optimistic that it can be done with the present constellation. It may sound like a big jump for many people, but since the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement, we have been working on this perspective for almost half a century. And therefore, I think I can judge. Sometimes you have to have a real existential crisis before people are willing to change their ways.
Yes, I wanted to sort of just emphasize some of the things, because as I said, when I was a student at university, and even before in high school, when I started to become interested in questions of economic development, I came to the conclusion, I suppose, my teachers and professors, with certain of them, because not all of them were, some were very right wing, but that the international economic structure itself was biased against the development of developing countries. So the IMF and the World Bank, and even the way they were structured, and even the United Nations and the IDB, etc. And so, I mean, the United Nations, you had ECLAC, and you had other, so you had all these parallel institutions coming up. And you mentioned the LaRouche movement, call for the new international economic order, the establishment of the International Development Bank. It was this sort of alternative structure, because all this post-World War II, these institutions really reflected the imperial powers of the day in 1945, and that so this call kind of died down a little in the 90s with globalization and the WTO coming up, but then you had the BRICS coming up, which was Brazil, Russia, India, China, right, and then South Africa, but that these countries now had an economic importance that they didn't have before, and so could actually have some economic weight in the world to change the paradigm. And I know you had your institute had talked about the United States should join the BRICS, but then I don't know at what point it happened chronologically, but I know that you started to call for a 4-power agreement between Russia, United States, India, and China, the 4 leading powers of the world, and in terms of population, economy, etc., to come together to really change the architecture? Because I really believe that it's the architecture of the global economy, the architecture of global politics that needs to change rather than be reformed. So is but you've been speaking about the P5 and these other things. Can you just tell me how the the program of the four power agreement and how that fits into the things you were discussing just now?
Well, my husband already many years ago said that in order to have a power combination which is stronger than the present British Empire, that is the financial powers to be, you need the combination of the four most powerful nation states, the United States, Russia, China, India, to cause that change to occur. You know, the United States going back to its tradition of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who wanted to, after the Second World War, to increase the living standard of every person on the planet. And unfortunately, he died, and Truman was basically a puppet of Churchill, so it did not really happen. So, you know, that is still an optimal combination. I mean, just I don't see that in the short term as a realistic perspective, because you know India is right now engaged in a fight with China, and there are big efforts by NATO to pull India in the direction of the Indo-Pacific expansion of NATO globally and all of these. I think President Modi is probably looking out for the best interest of India in this very difficult combination. But I don't think that the relation between India and China right now is very workable for such a four-power combination. Trump has this incredible coup against him in the United States, which is one of the biggest scandals in history. So I don't think it will work in the short term. But we have a short-term crisis. Now, what President Putin has proposed has three of those four powers. It has the United States, Russia, and China. Macron is, saying he wants to cooperate, which is good. Boris Johnson, who is from Britain, but surprisingly, he made a speech recently where he said that, Great Britain must go back to the policies of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal. What he proposes is too little. He only proposes £5 billion. But alone, the fact that people start to talk about Roosevelt, the New Deal, is a reference point, because all the countries of the 5 permanent UN Security Council members have at one point or another praised Franklin D. Roosevelt, the New Deal. So since it's the only realistic perspective on the table in this emergency crisis, I decided rather than insisting on the four powers, which is not realistic to take place in the short term, and President Putin using an existing mechanism, namely the UN Security Council, to bring about such a change. And both Putin and Lavrov have said many times, the purpose of this summit is to discuss principles which guarantee the peace, the long-term survivability of the human species. So I think that we should all really try to make that summit work. Now, again, I want to call on all your audience, join this conference of the Schiller Institute on the 5th and 6th of September. If you have social media, please spread the invitation. We want to build the audience as big as possible. And we will have very, very important speakers from Russia, from China, from Africa, from Europe, from other places, Latin America. We will have a big Latin American conference, by the way, of the Schiller Institute this coming Saturday, on the 15th of August. Join this program. It will be all in Spanish. You will have very sizable, prominent speakers and a forum to discuss how to join in a movement which can actually, really put all the people of goodwill in one boat to try to get the necessary change, get a new paradigm, and help to create a new human order which allows for the survival of every single human being on this planet, because that's the only thing which is worth the dignity of man.
Yes. Now, I mean, we have reached the end of the program, unfortunately, but I think that's a very good note to end on. So if people want to participate in the conference, to learn more about, because you put out tons of content, videos, webinars, classes, to learn about these things, to get involved, to do on the ground action, to do, to get involved in international linking. The website is it the schillerinstitute.org?
.com.
.com. So it's a .com, right? So Schiller, we'll put the link below, so they can go and they can sign petitions, and they can register for the conference, and they can also learn more about your program there. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we will definitely put that link there, and I encourage all of you who are interested in building a world of development for all, of peace and justice, to move us away from the sort of dystopian developments that we're moving towards further and further, to please get involved, because it's up to us to change the world, and nobody else can. So I want to thank you so much for this enlightening and thought-provoking conversation. It's been a pleasure having you on the program.
It's a pleasure to be on your show.
All right. That's it for this week's episode of A Story Club Global Politics. We were talking with our guest, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and president of the International Schiller Institute in Germany. Our topic was rebuilding economies in a post-lockdown world. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, like, share, and tell your friends about us. Also, please register for the upcoming conferences, sign the petitions on the Schiller Institute site. Thanks again, and I'll see you next week.